Thank you very much, everyone, for coming out today. This is a really exciting opportunity for me. A little bit of background about myself really quick, and then I'll get to what we all want to hear about, these rare postage stamps. I've been in the rare postage stamp business for about 8 years now. I was a history student in college. I started collecting stamps in college and was very quickly bitten by the bug of postage stamps. When I was a kid, I collected everything from fossils to old books to baseball cards, you name it. But I always thought that stamps were kind of, I don't know, it just didn't seem like the coolest hobby to me. It didn't seem like something that was very current or exciting. And then once I realized that stamps are much more than just little pieces of paper, they're little time capsules, they're little windows into the past, they're a lens through which we can view history, I was bitten by the bug and I started buying up every stamp I could find and really went from 0 to 60 very quickly. Was fortunate enough to transition that passion into a career right out of college. But one of the things that still gets me excited, it's still, I wake up every morning and can't wait to get into the office, and it's when I can make connections between the little pieces of paper that we're selling and the places they came from, the people who created them, the historical stories that we can tell through these stamps. Again, it's one thing to be sitting at your desk and have a rare stamp in front of you. It's another thing to be able to bring these stamps back to their home after 180-ish years. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today, is Milbury's place in philatelic history. How many people in this room knew about the Milbury stamp before today, out of curiosity? How many were aware that Milbury is one of the sort of meccas of stamp collecting? Interesting. I'm really excited to share this story with you. I'm going to start by sort of giving a bit of historical background about what led up to the stamp and then talk about the stamp itself. So our story begins in the 1830s in the United Kingdom. This gentleman here is named Roland Hill. He was a school teacher and a social reformer who is known as the father of the postage stamp. In the late 1830s, there was a lot of passion in England in particular for mail to become more accessible to the masses. Mail was, the original post office in the UK was set up for the royalty, basically. This is a way for the king and his subjects to communicate with each other, but as more people learned to read and write, as things like the Industrial Revolution started to happen, Roland Hill was very involved in trying to get everyday people to be able to send mail. The problem was, in the UK, postage rates were dependent on distance. So if you were sending a letter across London, that would have been cheaper than sending a letter to Dublin or to Scotland, for example. Roland Hill had this radical idea that postage rates would be based on weight rather than distance. So every half ounce or ounce that you sent would determine the postage, whether it was going down the street or going across the United Kingdom. I think it's fascinating that he had this idea back in the 1830s, because this is the same way our current United States Postal Service operates. If you send a letter from here to Boston or here to Seattle, it's going to cost you the same. It just depends on how heavy that letter is. This was a radical idea that people were sort of torn on. He had to really sell people on this idea of making the mail accessible to the masses. The other thing he devised was the concept of prepayment of postage. So prior to the 1830s and 40s, if you wanted to mail a letter, you had to go wait in line at the post office. And this was not that convenient for business people in particular. They would have staff whose job it would be to take letters to the post office every day. Roland Hill had this idea: if we standardize all postage rates in the UK at 1 penny, you can buy little adhesive pieces of paper worth 1 penny, and you can just slap those on a letter whenever you want to mail it. You can drop it in a box that's unattended. You don't have to go to the post office during working hours. And lo and behold, in May of 1840, the postage stamp was born. The first postage stamp in the world is the penny black. It was a 1 penny stamp with Queen Victoria's face on it. He also invented the first postal stationery. Do you guys remember when you could buy an envelope or a postal card with the postage printed right on it? He also invented that. That's called a Mulready letter sheet. This was a unfolded letter you could buy that was worth 1 penny. You wrote your message inside, folded it up, and that beautiful ornate design representing the British Empire was the postage itself. And as long as it was canceled by the Maltese cross, it was considered used. So this is the birth of postage in May of 1840. We're going to jump across the Atlantic to America, where news of Roland Hill's invention spread very quickly. People found out what was going on in the UK, and they wanted to bring that to America. But it wasn't the government that latched on to this idea. It was mostly private enterprise early on. The first recorded acknowledgement of the penny black and the Mulready letter sheet was actually from Daniel Webster. He submitted to Congress images of these things, and he said, hey, what do we think of maybe postage stamps in America? The idea fell on deaf ears. They went absolutely nowhere. So it was up to private businesses to issue the first postage stamps in America. In 1842, a company called the City Dispatch Post was founded in New York City. They issued the first adhesive postage stamp in the Western Hemisphere. This was a service. Siri's even joining in. At the time, you wouldn't receive mail to your home or to your business. You would have to go to the post office to collect your mail. And likewise, if you wanted to mail something, they wouldn't pick it up at your door. You had to go to the post office to mail it. So companies such as the City Dispatch Post would collect mail at the post office and bring it to your house for about a penny. Or they would collect mail at your home, bring it to the post office. Or if you were within New York City, they would pick up mail at your house and deliver it to another address within New York City. And very quickly, this service became popular, more popular than the government post in many ways. So the government started trying to variously compete with the private post offices, as well as just legislate them out of business. Even more interesting is this letter at the lower left. In about 1843, private companies started establishing themselves that wouldn't just deliver mail within one city, they would deliver mail between cities. So you had these networks that cropped up from Detroit and Chicago to Albany and Buffalo, all the way down to New York City, along the eastern seaboard, from Philadelphia to Boston, all the way up into Maine, that were carrying mail between cities in opposition to the federal government. The companies that were operating within New York City or within Boston, the government didn't care too much about initially because they were providing a service separate from the government. But once companies started carrying mail between cities and at a much cheaper rate than the government, there were going to be problems. So for example, a letter between Boston and New York City carried by the government in the early 1840s would have cost 18 3/4 cents. Private companies started carrying mail for 5 cents, less than a third the cost. People start using these private mail carriers. The government is getting frustrated because for them to be able to lower postage rates, they need the volume. They need more people to be using the government post. They're trying to explain to people, hey, if you go with the independent company, we know it's cheaper, but it actually is going to make us increase our rates, ironically, because you're undercutting our business. A battle breaks out over the course of 1844. Finally, by early 1845, Congress decides they need to step in and do something about this problem. I thought this was a great article because it was actually comes out of Worcester, not too far from here. This is January of 1845. People calling on Congress to pass a new postal bill. Postage rates in America were a mess at the time. There were 6 or 7 different rate classes depending on distance. Postmasters had these very complex books to measure, because everything was done by the post roads, not as the crow flies. So if you're sending a letter from New York, upstate up the Hudson Valley, you had to figure out exactly how many miles that letter was going to traverse, exactly the weight of the letter in order to figure out the postage, and you couldn't really prepay the postage unless you waited in line at the post office. So in March of 1845, Congress says, we're done with the private companies competing with us, we're done with the complex rate structures, we're going to make everything easy. If you send a letter under 1/2 ounce, under 300 miles, it's 5 cents. If you send that same letter over 300 miles, it's 10 cents. And every increment of a 1/2 ounce is another 5 cents. So 1 ounce under 300 miles, that's 10 cents. Everything is done in 5s and 10s for the first time. And America rejoices. The other thing the government does is they explicitly state that these private mail companies carrying mail between cities are illegal. They realize they can't compete with them. So in addition to lowering their own rates, they outlaw the carriage of mail along postal roads. So, we still have names like Boston Post Road and Albany Post Road today. The government says if mail travels along a post road, it has to be carried under contract to the government. So there's a lot of rejoicing in America. Postage rates are lower than ever, they're easier to understand than ever, and this is going to sort of open the floodgates to allow everyday Americans to send mail. It also leads to the creation of the first government adhesive postage stamps issued by various cities throughout America. And there's a really sort of interesting, I don't want to say selfish, but self-serving reason behind this. If you were a postmaster in the 1840s, your salary, your compensation, was dependent on how much money your post office made. So a postmaster in New York City would make a lot more than a postmaster in a small town like Millbury. There were also two ways to send mail at this point. You could prepay your mail, and then the person who received it would get it for free, or you could send your mail collect, and the recipient had to pay for their mail. And what I think is really interesting, my thought is if I was sending somebody a letter, I would want to prepay to, as an act of goodwill towards them. But the opposite was true in America. If you were a business person and you were writing one of your colleagues or competitors, you didn't want to insult them by paying the postage for them. So mail would oftentimes be sent collect as a way of saying, you know what, you're receiving a letter from me, I recognize that you are wealthy enough to pay for your own mail. And I think this sort of social dynamic is really interesting. And the government, the government doesn't want mail being sent collect, because if they can't find the recipient, or if the recipient refuses delivery, the government's already performed the service, they're not getting paid anything for it. So postmasters and the federal government and everybody are trying to figure out how can we get people to prepay for their mail. And it starts with Robert Morris, the postmaster of New York City, who says, I'm going to issue adhesive stamps in order to convince people to prepay for their mail. The convenience, the fact that you can go buy a sheet of 40 stamps and keep them in your house and use them as needed. This was one of his ways of trying to get people to prepay. Again, self-serving motive here is that the more people prepay for mail at the New York Post Office, the more he gets paid. Over the next 2 years before the federal government's first postage stamps are issued in mid-1847. So you've got this 2-year gap here from mid-1845 to mid-1847, where people follow in the footsteps of Robert Morris and start issuing their own postage stamps that are only valid in their respective cities. And there's 11 communities across America that issued these provisional postage stamps. Like I said, New York is one of them. Millbury is one of the other 11 communities. There's really no rhyme or reason to these communities. Some of them are big cities like St. Louis and New York. Some of them are tiny towns like Boscawen, New Hampshire, which is essentially just a suburb of Concord. So I love that these 11 seemingly random communities are linked in history, in that they are the only ones in America that issued provisional postage stamps in this very short window in the mid-1840s. So real quick, I'm going to show examples of each of these, and then we're going to focus on the Millbury stamp, because that's why we all gathered here today. Alexandria, Virginia was part of Washington. It was part of the District of Columbia at the time. It wasn't part of Virginia yet. They issued a postage stamp that is typically found on buff colored paper. There's 6 examples on this sort of tannish buff color, and 1 example on blue paper. This was one of the first major stamps I ever sold in my career. It brought $1.2 million back in 2019. It's called the Alexandria Blue Boy. It's got a great story behind it that I'll tell you really quick. The correspondence was between a young couple in Alexandria, one of whom was, I believe, Episcopalian, one of whom was Methodist. And their families were at odds with one another over their religious differences, sort of a Romeo and Juliet story. Their families would not allow them to date publicly. So they had to secretly send mail to one another. The original letter that was in this envelope still exists, and there's a little line at the bottom that says, "As usual, burn after reading." And for whatever reason, she did not burn this envelope or the letter. It is the only example known on blue paper. It's one of the highlights of American stamp collecting. Like I said, $1.2 million. The couple eventually, there were a couple of the patriarchs and matriarchs of the family died off. The couple married several years after the letter was sent. And there's sort of an apocryphal story that they sold the letter in the early 1900s to pay for this couple's grandchildren's wedding. So there's a lot of real romantic sentiment around this letter. The fact that I was able to handle it and sell it was one of the highlights of my career. Annapolis, Maryland issued, I explained earlier, this postal stationery when the postage is stamped onto the letter itself. Annapolis issued a very rare pre-stamped envelope. There's only 2 in existence. This one last sold a couple of years ago for about $600,000. Baltimore, Maryland issued stamps with a facsimile signature of James Buchanan, who When I started collecting stamps, I thought this was President James Buchanan. Coincidentally, the postmaster of Baltimore had the same name. No, I believe there was a relation to the president, but that is not President James Buchanan's signature. They issued 5-cent and 10-cent stamps as well as stamped envelopes. This, maybe not the most beautiful envelope at the lower right, is the only surviving provisional stamp from Boscawen, New Hampshire. Basically, they just took whatever postal devices they had lying around the office, took a scrap of paper, stamped them on that paper, and applied it to an envelope. Again, it's not going to win any beauty pageants, but it's a wonderful piece of history. The fact that this was able to survive. And those two ugly stains on either side of it are from a very famous stamp collector named Arthur Hind from upstate New York. Arthur Hind was a very prominent stamp collector, but stamp collecting in the 1920s was more primitive than it is today, and he would actually take pieces of adhesive tape, almost like an adhesive bandage, and stick the envelopes into his album using this very not archival quality tape. So whenever you see an envelope like this that has these horrible stains on either side, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's not the prettiest, but it also tells you that it belonged to Arthur Hind, the great industrialist and very prominent stamp collector. So it gives you a little peek into the provenance of an envelope like that. Really quick, going through more of the cities that issued provisionals. Brattleboro, Vermont, there's about 19 envelopes that survive with the Brattleboro stamp on it. Lockport, New York, along with Boscawen, is one of 2 unique postmaster provisionals. This is, once again, the only one in existence, and once again, they just took whatever postal device they had laying around and fashioned a little adhesive stamp without much thought to aesthetics or quality or anything like that. Milbury, we'll talk about more in a little bit. New Haven, Connecticut issued stamped envelopes using a very volatile ink that has not stood the test of time well. So you'll see pictures of New Haven envelopes in auction catalogs from the early 1900s, and they look gorgeous. You look at that same envelope today, the postage has essentially faded away completely. I think within another generation or 2, there are envelopes that will have no trace of their postage on them because the ink used was so unstable. And then lastly, New York City, like I said, Robert Morris issued the first postmaster provisionals in 1845. Many consider them to be amongst the most beautiful stamps ever produced, with a portrait of George Washington, one of 2 provisionals to feature George Washington, the other being Milbury, of course, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. These were also the most widespread postage stamps used in America up until this point, even more so than those private post offices in the 1842 to 1845 period. For many Americans, the New York Provisional would have been their first encounter with a postage stamp. This would have introduced them to the concept of adhesive postage. Providence, Rhode Island issued 5 and 10 cent stamps, like several of the other cities. And then at the bottom, these are the St. Louis Bears, as they're known to collectors. It incorporates the state seal of Missouri, which has a bear on either side of the seal. They issued 5, 10, and 20 cent stamps, along with the New York Provisional, considered to be some of the most beautiful early postage stamps in America because they incorporated such a great whimsical design with the bears. Let's talk about the Millbury Provisional, though, and the fact that I'm standing in this house while I talk about this is really, really exciting. So this stamp was created under the administration of Asa Waters, who was the 3rd. He was the son of the gentleman who constructed this house and who's right behind me. He served as postmaster of Millbury from 1836 to 1848, so about a 12-year time span. He had a gentleman named Henry Waterman, who was his deputy postmaster in the sort of later years of his administration. And then when Waters stepped down, he put in a good word and had Waterman appointed as postmaster. He only served for a couple of months, late 1848 into 1849. What's fascinating, though, is that the Millbury postage stamps were not discovered by collectors until 1884, so almost 40 years after they were produced. They were printed in 1846. Collectors were completely unaware of them until 2 examples were located in the collection of the American Antiquarian Society, not far from here, in Worcester. And what's fascinating is that at this point in 1884, when the stamps are discovered, Waters III is still alive. He's still living in Millbury. And a very well-known stamp collector of the time, Hiram Dietz, wrote him a letter and said, what do you remember about the creation of these postage stamps? Can you give me any information? I generally don't like PowerPoint slides with a lot of text, but I thought it was interesting to include Waters' whole response here because I don't think this has been published in the philatelic literature, at least, since 1902. And I bolded the parts that I think are really interesting. Waters admitted, quote, I never had much to do with the details, but relied mostly on my deputies. He sounds like he was very hands-off postmaster. He obviously had a lot else going on in town with his, his other businesses. He did remember, though, that I have an impression that Waterman did get up some kind of postmaster stamp, but too slight to state positively. Waterman was from Providence. He was back living in Providence by this point in the 1880s. I think there were attempts to get a hold of him. I don't know that anybody was ever successful. But my favorite line is the last one. I wish to inquire why this eager pursuit of a 5-cent Millbury post office stamp of 1845, for which several advertisements have appeared in papers. What's up? Obviously, Waters did not understand the appeal of stamp collecting, which was sort of coming into its own as a hobby in the 1870s and 1880s. And this was a time when there were still a lot of family correspondences shoved into trunks and stuck into attics. So you'd get stamp dealers and stamp collectors placing advertisements in newspapers saying, hey, do you have any old family letters? I want the stamps off of them. Especially after the Civil War, you'd get people from the north going down to the south, going from town to town trying to buy up old correspondences. So the stamp was discovered in 1884. Waters, sounds like he didn't want much to do with it or didn't have much to offer to collectors. And then over the next couple of decades, 19 examples of the Millbury postage stamp turned up. Of these, 8 of them are on their original envelopes. 7 of them were used but have been taken off of their envelopes. 3 of them are on pieces of their original envelopes. And then one of the stamps, this one at the top right, is unused. It has its original gum on the back of the stamp. It was never placed onto a letter. And of the 19 examples in existence of the Millbury stamp, this is sort of considered to be the holy grail. This is the one that escaped being stuck onto a letter. Somebody must have stuck it into a book or into, it must have just gotten mixed up in somebody's papers and then found its way into the hands of stamp collectors. So here gathered together are all 19 examples of the stamp. I want to talk about the design because I think it has a real charm to it, is the word I would use. You can see on the far left, that's the first postage stamp in America. This is that private stamp that was printed in 1842. First stamp in all of the Western Hemisphere, as a matter of fact. And you can see it has a portrait of George Washington. America doesn't put living people on its postage stamps. It's not like the UK where the current head of state has to go on the stamp. So when the penny black was printed in 1840, it was natural to put Queen Victoria on it. In America, there's a bit more of a decision-making process because you're not going to put Polk or Zachary Taylor or somebody on a stamp. You look back in history, and George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, America's first Postmaster General, are sort of the 2 low-hanging fruit in terms of stamp design. So first postage stamp in America is I would say, a moderately executed portrait of George Washington. The New York City Provisional was printed by the country's leading banknote printers. So this was sort of a stock image of George Washington that was used on, you can find currency from the 1830s, 1840s, from all over the United States that used this image of George Washington on it. It is very finely executed. I think it's it's based on, of course, Stuart's portrait of George Washington. There is speculation that the Millbury stamp was inspired by letters being sent from New York City to Millbury or the surrounding communities with that provisional stamp on it. But whether it was Waterman, whether it was Waters himself, whoever it was who had the idea to put George Washington on it, did not have the artistic skill of America's leading banknote printers. So they did the best they could. One of the early stamp journals, I think, is somewhat unfair. It says that the stamp allegedly depicts George Washington. I think we can all tell it's George Washington. It's been described as cartoonish or primitive, but I think it's whimsical. I think it's almost a piece of American folk art from the 1840s. I think that it's perfectly of its time, and it's a wonderful design for a stamp. And then 1847, the first federally issued postage stamps that are valid anywhere in America come out. There's a 5-cent stamp with Ben Franklin, 10-cent stamp with George Washington, and you can see it was printed by the same firm that did the New York stamp, and they just took the same image of George Washington, reversed it, mirror image, and I love this sort of progression of images of George Washington on stamp. So again, this is that stamp that was in the top right corner. This is the main attraction. This is the unique, unused Milbury Provisional Stamp. There couldn't have been many of these things printed in the first place. We were talking right before I got up here about how they were printed. Traditionally, people have thought it was either typographed or a wood block print. But myself and my colleagues have had the opportunity to study a number of these lately, and looking at the characteristics of the ink and the paper, it's more and more looking like they were actually lithographed. So there was probably a lithographic stone with just one subject. These were printed individually. The New York stamps were printed in sheets of 40. It's likely that every single Milbury stamp was printed from the same subject on the same lithographic stone. They didn't leave much of a mark in real time. You saw that Waters didn't really remember them. I've poured through tons of newspapers from all of New England looking for contemporaneous references to the stamps from Brattleboro, Boscawen, Millbury, New Haven, Providence, and there's not much discussion of them. This probably was something that if you were, friends with Waters, friends with the post office, and you went there often, they may have been familiar to you, but this wasn't, it didn't make a huge splash in real time. It wasn't really until stamp collectors came along decades later that people recognized what an important part of the development of our post office these provisional stamps were. Because within a year or so, everyone's using the same stamps with Washington and Franklin on them. And I think these were probably erased from memory fairly quickly. It was just sort of a flash in the pan, but it's a flash in the pan that luckily we have this physical evidence of. And the fact that there are 19 of them that survive, I think is incredible. The fact that one of them survived without being used, I think is especially remarkable. This stamp is, as of right now, in the collection of a gentleman named William H. Gross. He was a co-founder of PIMCO. He's from Southern California. He's known as the Bond King. He's a very wealthy, very charitable individual who, once he built up his business, he wanted to revisit his childhood hobby of stamp collecting, and he had the means to do it better than most anyone else. So he set out to collect one of each one of each stamp ever produced in the United States. If it existed in mint condition, he would buy it in mint condition. If it existed in only used condition, he would sell for that. And he's one of only about 3 people in history who have been able to complete their collection of United States stamps. There's a couple of stamps of which only one exists. So at most, one person at any given time can have a complete collection of United States stamps. He made some of the key acquisitions back in the late 90s, early 2000s. So it's been a while since anybody's even had an opportunity to bid on many of these items. Of course, he could have settled for any of the 18 other Milbury stamps, but when he found out there was a mint copy out there, he had to have the mint one, which is really incredible for to have both the inclination and the means to pursue something like that. And this collection is coming up for auction June 14th and 15th in New York City. There's plenty of highlights in the sale. There's a very famous stamp from the 1860s called the 1-cent Siegel. That's one on the cover of the booklets on the tables, that's sort of the holy grail of stamp collecting. There's 2 of them in existence. One of them is owned by the New York Public Library. The other is in Bill Gross's collection and will come up for auction on the 14th. But the Milbury is one of these stamps that maybe it's not as recognizable as the inverted Jenny with the upside down airplane or the Z-Grill. My mother was watching a TV show, I forget what it was recently, and they had the 1-cent Z-Grill as sort of the token rare stamp in the television show. But for those who appreciate the history of the mail, for those who understand the rarity of any postmaster provisional in mint condition, let alone one from a smaller town like Millbury compared to New York City or St. Louis or Providence, for people who understand just what this stamp is, it's considered to be one of the most spectacular, incredible stamps in existence. And when I found out that this was going to be in our office for a couple of months leading up to the sale, I spoke to our marketing director, I spoke to the president of the company, and I said, we have to go to Millbury with the stamp. We have to bring it home. I don't know where it will end up come June. I don't know who's going to be the lucky next owner, but I thought as long as it's in my possession, we've got to make a trip with this thing and bring it home. So I'm very excited. The other thing is, we spoke to a client of ours a couple of days ago who owns one of the examples of the Millbury on Peace, and we told him we were going up to Millbury to bring the mint stamp home. He goes, well, can you bring my stamp as well? Because I want it to have been in the house. I want it to have gone back to Millbury after 178 years or so. So I was lucky enough to actually bring 2 copies of those 19 with me. For anyone who'd like to see them after, I'll have them with me the rest of the afternoon. But the fact that I'm in the Waters family home, the gentleman who, even if he didn't remember it, is responsible for the creation of this stamp. And if he appointed watermen who made the stamp, I consider Asa Waters III, responsible for the creation of this stamp, sort of transitively. But just to be back in Millbury, I don't know if anyone else has ever brought these stamps back home. I know a lot of people who have owned them over the years, and I don't know that anybody else has ever had this compulsion to contextualize the stamps and again, bring them home. So that's why I'm so excited to be here. I really appreciate everyone coming out this morning, and if you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, because again, this is just a real treat for me, and I appreciate the hospitality so much.